Well, it's a great privilege for me to introduce to our panel a very distinguished writer, analyst, researcher, in a way, a statesman who has taken very significant positions in the area of tax justice, illicit financial flows, and the effect it has on societies globally. I'm the proud owner of two books of Raymond. The first book is Capitalism's Achilles Heel, which many of you have seen, how it deals with dirty money and how to renew the free market system. And Raymond's most recent book, which some of you may be familiar with, called Invisible Trillions, how financial secrecy is imperiling capitalism and democracy and the way to renew our broken system. I think the wisdom that is inherent in these two books is something that is very, very helpful to all of us who are dealing with the area of illicit flows, corporate malfeasance, and dealing above all with tax justice, which Raymond has been trying to address through many different approaches over the years. Raymond has had a distinguished career as a businessman, as a researcher with the Brookings, and of course, as a writer and author and a public speaker. So with that, let me turn it over to Raymond for his presentation to us. Thank you, Raymond.
Thank you very much, Krishen and Thomas. Dominic, I enjoyed your remarks. I gather that this group is primarily focused on the question of structural change and how to go about achieving that. I'm going to pitch my remarks in that direction and share with you some of my journey, some of what I have tried to contribute to change, change needed for our shared interest. I was reared in a fundamentalist religious family. My upbringing was in Shreveport, Louisiana. You may have read a little bit about that. The new Speaker of the House of Representatives here in Washington was from Shreveport, and I'm not suggesting that's the greatest recommendation from for the city. I'm just suggesting that is a fact. After high school, grammar school and high school, I went to Georgia Tech, then did my military service, then went on to Harvard Business School. At Harvard, I was enormously impressed with the range of experiences and the range of knowledge that so many of our classmates had. Just to give you an example, a couple of months ago, I spoke with one of my old classmates who was one of my best friends at Harvard, Paul Sperry. When Paul left Harvard Business School, he did a little bit of work, but then made a breakthrough with his voice, and over the decades became one of America's premier tenors and has performed all over the United States and in many other countries. There was a wonderful group of people with diverse experiences and capabilities. The second semester of my second year, I was asking myself a lot of questions and decided that I wanted to take a course at Harvard University under a Christian theologian named Paul Tillich. Thomas, I'm sure you are familiar with his thinking. I went to the Harvard Business School appropriate dean, and he approved it, and I took the course under Paul Tillich. I don't think I understood a word that he said the whole semester. This was all completely new thinking to me, taught at a level that I barely grasped. But it did underline for me what emerged as the most fundamental lesson that I took out of Harvard Business School, which was, if you ask the right questions, you can get the right answers. Now, admittedly, this was a question within a business framework, but I subsequently have applied that to other contexts in which I have been involved. After I graduated, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I was asking myself, what do I want to do? I took a job teaching at the University of New Hampshire. Now, how in the world does a recent graduate of business school with a master's get a job teaching on a faculty? The regular teacher of the course entitled Business Management passed away just 6 or 8 weeks before the semester was to start. The course was required to get your undergraduate degree in business administration. University of New Hampshire was desperate to find somebody to teach this course, and they gave me the job. I did teach it. I used Harvard Business School case studies. I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, and I was asked to stay on the faculty. But I said no. I had a lot more questions about the world that I wanted to begin to get answers to. So in the summer of 1961, I went back to Harvard University, and I took a course in 20th century philosophical movements, a course in the history of architecture, and a course in music appreciation, all of which I had not had an opportunity to take at either Georgia Tech or Harvard Business School. I had been thinking about getting a taste for international business. So I decided that I would look for a job that would allow me to go overseas. I applied to a lot of companies, sent my resumes to a lot of companies, ended up getting offers to go to Iran and Nigeria and Brazil. I chose Nigeria because it was English speaking, because it was a newly independent country, having just become independent the preceding year, 1960, and because I could walk off the plane and manage a company that I had been hired to run. So off I go to Nigeria. One of the early people that I encountered in Nigeria was an old coaster, a British gentleman who had been in Nigeria for many years, working for John Holt Trading Company, a British trading company that had been active up and down the west coast of Africa since the late 1800s. And I asked this gentleman, how do you do business in Africa? And boy, he looked me up one side and down the other, was not the least bit forthcoming. I certainly got the impression that he did not like Americans showing up in his ex-British colony so soon after independence. But I pressed on, as is my American manner, and I asked him, well, okay, tell me, how do you price your imported cars and building materials and textiles to sell in the Nigerian market? And the guy looks me up one side and down the other again, and he says, price? Price is not a problem. I'm not trying to make a profit. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I had just finished teaching business management at the University of New Hampshire. I just finished Harvard Business School, getting a master's degree. And here, one of the early people I talked to in Africa says, I'm not trying to make a profit. What's going on here? It took me a while to understand that what he was talking about is something called transfer pricing. That is to say, everything that the parent company in the UK shipped to him to sell in Nigeria, in the subsidiary in Nigeria, was already priced at such a high level that all he had to do was to pay the invoices, and whatever profits he might earn in Nigeria were automatically being shifted back to the UK. Transfer pricing, pricing in such a way as to transfer the profits abroad. This just fascinated me, to see a process by which the capitalist system, which I thought I had understood in some degree, was working in a way that was completely different from my framework of understanding. I spent 2 years in Nigeria running a business that was a bakery, as it turns out, that was owned by the foreign minister of Nigeria, and then decided I wanted to go into business in Nigeria for myself. I returned to New York, incorporated a company, returned to Nigeria and registered it, and hired an office space, and went back to New York and got engaged to my sweetheart, whom I had met in that Harvard class on 20th century philosophical movements. Off we went. My wife, Pauline, had in the meantime, between when I met her in 1961 and 1964, when we got married and went to Nigeria, she had in the meantime finished all of her coursework for her PhD in political science at UCLA. Off we went to Nigeria on this grand journey of trying to go into a business. I wasn't getting very far until in 1965, the manager of Bank of America called me in and said, the Speaker of the House of Parliament in Nigeria, Alhaji Jallo Ibrahim Muhammad Waziri, has a trucking company, and the trucking company is in bad financial shape. We've loaned the trucking company money. It appears to be going out of business. Would you like to take it on a management contract and see if you can straighten it out? I decided to look into it. The first thing we had to do was to get an insurance policy on the life of Jallo Waziri. Now, Jallo Waziri was a big man. So the insurance policy was out of fear that he might die at any time. He was an excessively big man. Anyway, he goes to his doctor. The doctor fills out the form and gets to the part where he's supposed to record the weight of Jallo Waziri. Jallo Waziri steps on the scale, and the pointer bangs against the maximum peg on the other side, indicating that he weighed more than 20 stones. That is more than 280 pounds. So the doctor couldn't fill out the form until we got a weight on the individual. So where to get a weight? I called up the manager of Avery Scale, and he said, "Oh, this is easy. All you have to do is to take him out of the Parliament building, walk across the road to the race course, and put him on the horse scales." Now, here I am, still in my 20s, trying to figure out how to make it in Nigeria, and I'm supposed to go take the Speaker of the House of Parliament to get it. No, I'm not going to do that. So I called the manager of Avery Scale back again and said, "Look, you got to come up with some other idea." He finally suggested the scales at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs used to weigh diplomatic pouches going out of the country. And I said, okay, I can sell that idea. We got the weight, we got the insurance policy, the loan extension, and I took over the management of JIM Transport, the initials of Jallo Ibrahim Muhammad. First thing I learned is that once a truck is out of sight, you have absolutely no idea where it's going or what it's doing. I mean, it has a load to deliver to a destination, but the driver can go off and do his own short hauling. He can take on the cargo of others to haul. He can sell off the tires. He can sell off the tarpaulins. He can sell off part of the cargo, saying it was stolen. You have no control over what's happening. So we weren't getting very far in trying. I wasn't getting anywhere trying to straighten out the company. And then Nigeria's first coup d'etat took place in 1966 and was followed by the Biafran War, the Nigerian Civil War. Meantime, the company had been unable to pay me my management fees, so I had swapped management fees for some percentage interest in the company, and here we were now in a situation of conflict in the country, and corruption in the business, corruption throughout the trucking industry in Nigeria. So, we're getting close to going out of business, and I had no idea what to do. Finally, I called together 4 of the senior drivers, and I said, "Look, this isn't working. We're gonna go out of business. You're gonna lose your jobs. We got to do something." After 4 long sessions of discussions with these drivers over a period of a month, we finally decided to create what we called a truck manager's contract. The driver would sign a contract with our company, JIM Transport. The contract said there would be no overhauling, no overloading, no short hauling, no selling off pieces of the truck, no bringing back false receipts for supposed repair. In other words, in return for completely honest operation, we agreed to a package of incentives for the drivers. The package included, we doubled their salaries. We gave them a trip allowance so that if they had to spend some money for minor repairs, they could do so, but don't bring us back any of these receipts for little repairs. If you have to spend it, spend it. If you don't have to spend it, you can keep it. Then we establish a bonus for round trips to the north. The minimum that we expected was 3 round trips to the north of Nigeria. Some of our destinations were more than 1,000 miles away, so 3 round trips a month was the minimum that we established. For 3.5, we agreed to a bonus. For 4 round trips a month, we agreed to a super bonus. And then the smartest thing that we did was to establish an award for the best driver of the year, an all expense paid trip to go to Mecca to make the Hajj. All of the drivers were Muslim. We were giving them all an opportunity to go to Mecca, become al-Hajjis, and return with that elevated stature and prestige. All of our drivers signed that contract with us, and then started running up and down the roads as fast and safely as they could. As far as I know, the normal problems of the trucking industry in Nigeria completely disappeared for us. We had no more overloading and short hauling. We had none of that. Within 2 or 3 months, we became what I suspect was the most profitable trucking company in Nigeria. I say that because we had a lot of other drivers come from other companies and asked to go to work for us. We bought more trucks. We equipped all of the trucks with all steel body trailers so that they could load the cargo, lock the doors, go to their destination. We prospered. We turned that company around within 2 or 3 months, just like that. It was a process of deciding, as I had learned at Harvard Business School, deciding I had to ask better questions than I had been asking, and I had to find the right answers. We did so, and that company prospered. I bought 2 other manufacturing companies during the Civil War in Nigeria, when people who were obviously smarter than me were selling out. and leaving the country. I ended the Civil War with substantial investment in the trucking company and in the two manufacturing companies. We created a holding company. We sold majority interest to Nigerian shareholders. We borrowed money, expanded all of our businesses, and prospered very, very nicely. Up until the mid-1970s, we continued to prosper, but in the mid-1970s, Nigeria was becoming so corrupt. The military regime that had won the war was becoming incredibly corrupt, and it wasn't as much fun as it used to be. So my wife and I and two children moved back to the U.S. And we brought with us Mary, the nanny that we had hired to help take care of our children. She went with us to New York for the birth of our second child, and she went back to the States with us when we moved back in 1975 to help us as we got situated in a new house in the United States. In the 70s and 80s, did business all over the world, and I observed corruption and money laundering and falsified pricing and tax evasion. And at the same time, I think I observed more poverty, certainly than anyone of my acquaintance. But the turning point, there were then two turning points for me. My partner in the trucking company, Jallo Waziri, died in 1987. I spent the next 3 months learning how to be a playwright and writing a play, which was entitled Waziri. It started out autobiographical, the relationship of me, a white American from a Christian upbringing, and Jallo Waziri, a Black African with a Muslim tradition, and how we were trying to come together. It didn't work autobiographically, so I stopped that and refocused, making the two characters fictional. And I did produce a play entitled Waziri. It was staged at the Spotlighters Theater in Baltimore, Maryland. It was described as possibly the best script ever, submitted to the Playwrights Festival, which had been going on for 10 years, producing a number of plays. But for me, what was important is that the experience of writing a play allowed me to learn how to put passions and emotions on the printed page. And that experience has influenced all of my writing since then, including in the 2 books that I have published and other writings that I have done. Then a few years later, I had a second life-changing experience. After we moved back to the States, I sold 2 of my companies and kept 1, and went back to Nigeria every year or 2 to see how they were getting along. And every time I went back, I would call on Mary, the nanny who had lived with us for about a year in Nigeria, and for about 2 years after we came back to the States. I'd always made a point of seeing Mary. And so in this particular trip in 1995, I asked my staff to bring Mary to the hotel where I was staying. She called me from downstairs, came upstairs and knocked on the door, and I opened it. And there in front of me stood a weazened and disheveled old woman who seemingly had aged 30 years since I had seen her just a couple of years earlier. She came into the room and greeted me warmly. And as I was reaching for my wallet to get the pictures of my son and my daughter to show to her, she fell to her knees on the floor and begged me, with her hands gripping my ankles and her head touching my feet and her tears flooding the carpet, begged me to take her only son, her only child, back with me to America and bring him up as a member of my own family. This was during the Abacha years. Sani Abacha was Nigeria's worst dictator in the 1990s and was driving his country off of an economic cliff. Mary was a victim of this process. She had fallen through the cracks in Africa's extended family system. She was unemployed, homeless, destitute, and despondent. But note, she was not asking me to give her anything. She was asking to give me the only thing in the world that she had. Before I left Nigeria on that trip, 2 days later, Mary had a job and a roof over her head and a place to live, and her son had re-enrolled in secondary school. This was a staggering experience for me. And I decided at that point, that's it. I have to say what I have to say. I realized that across the many years of my career in Nigeria and in dozens and dozens of other countries around the world, I had seen more money laundering and more financial crime and more tax evasion, and at the same time, more poverty than anyone I knew. And I decided that I had to say what I have to say about these phenomena. So I came back home. I applied to the MacArthur Foundation for a grant to do a project entitled Flight Capital, Poverty, and Free Market Economics. I associated with the Brookings Institution as a guest scholar in economic studies, and I spent 5 or 6 years traveling the world and thinking about this business that I was looking at. As I went into Brookings, let me back up a minute. There are 3 sources of illegal money that flow out of developing countries: corrupt, criminal, and commercial. The corrupt component is money stolen by government officials and sent abroad. The criminal component is the activities of drug dealers and human traffickers and criminal syndicate heads and so forth. The commercial component is what I had been looking at for years, primarily the use of falsified pricing and the whole framework of the financial secrecy system that's used to shift money out of the country, out of countries. I thought the biggest component was the corrupt component. During my research at Brookings, and particularly as I traveled to 11 countries and conducted 335 interviews, I came to the opposite conclusion. I realized that the corrupt component, and I'm talking about the cross-border flow of illicit money, the corrupt component was the smallest, the criminal was next, and the commercial component, which is what I had been seeing for decades, the commercial component was by far the biggest. I wrote my first book, Capitalism's Achilles Heel, and then we created Global Financial Integrity. I hired Tom Cardamone, who spoke just a little while ago, to be managing director, and he's now the president and CEO of Global Financial Integrity. One of the early conversations that Tom and I had was, what do we call this stuff that we are talking about? My first book, Capitalism's Achilles Heel, had been subtitled Dirty Money. And I said, we can't call this dirty money. If we do, we will make people like Krishen, Mehta, and Dominic, and other accountants and lawyers go running out of the room. They don't want to deal with the question of dirty money. So what do we call this phenomenon that we're talking about? Do we just call it corruption or money laundering or tax evasion or flight capital or what? Finally, we decided to call it illicit financial flows. We concluded this sounded much more sophisticated and would appeal to a little bit better to lawyers and economists and so forth. So we decided to name this phenomenon illicit financial flows. It is the terminology that is used all over the world now, including in the Sustainable Development Goals, with a commitment by 193 countries to try to address this problem. I then wrote my first book. I had tried to explain the system that moves corrupted illicit money around the world. And I found it extremely difficult to write because nobody knew what I was talking about. This was not a widely understood subject in the mid-2000s. So I finally, in my first book, decided that I would present this with humor. And I wrote the Dirty Money User Manual. That was in my first book. And I told you exactly how to operate in secret and move money as you want to. In my second book, Invisible Trillions, I renewed my effort to try to explain the financial secrecy system, and did so, I think, more successfully. And I went into quite some detail about some of the things that you know about, tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions and disguised corporations, that is, shell companies, more of them having been created in the United States than in any other country. I talked about anonymous trust accounts. I talked about fake financial, fake foundations, fake charitable foundations. I talked about hybrid entities that can appear to be a corporation in one place and a partnership in another place and a trust account in another place, and you can move money through these hybrid entities, escaping taxes and accountability at every step of the way. I talked about money laundering techniques, and I talked about holes left in the laws of the United States, the UK, and most other wealthier countries to facilitate the movement of money through this financial secrecy system and ultimately into our own economies. But something has to link these things together. Something has to make it easy to operate and link these various tentacles together. I realized that something is falsified pricing. It's that transfer pricing that I had seen at the beginning of the 1960s. Falsified pricing is the key mechanism that is used to make the financial secrecy system function. Same thing that I had been looking at beginning in the 1960s and ever since. As I put all of these pieces together, I came to understand that something utterly fundamental has happened in the capitalist system, and therefore in the democratic capitalist system across recent decades. The original pillars of democracy have not fundamentally changed. Formulated in the late 1700s to include popular vote, a rule of law, representative legislatures, protection of minority rights. These original tenets, while imperfectly implemented, are still in place in the capitalist system. The original tenets of democracy are fundamentally changed. The original tenets of the democratic system were spreading wealth, producing public goods, and generating public goods and spreading wealth. The original tenets of the capitalist system, as created in also in the late 1700s, are now drastically altered. Capitalism has taken on a new motivation, a motivation to operate in secret, to disguise the movement of income in the tens of billions of dollars annually, and to secrete and shelter wealth in the trillions of dollars cumulatively. Secrecy has become as important in the capitalist system as profitability. This is a new development in the capitalist system. While various of the components of the financial secrecy system were in place years earlier, what has changed is that the use of these systems has become completely normalized across the corporate world, across the capitalist system. This is a recent phenomenon in the capitalist system. Most people, when they think about corruption and so forth, they think that, oh, this is a subject that pertains to those corrupt countries over there. Not correct. The financial secrecy system, as I have very briefly described it here and in much more detail in my book, every single element of the financial secrecy system was created by us in the richer Western countries. Not a single piece of it was created by drug dealers or criminal syndicate heads or corrupt government officials or even terrorist financiers or what have you. No, this is entirely created by us for the purpose of moving and sheltering money in a disguised manner. The result of the financial secrecy system, which is the major part of what I write about in my new book, Invisible Trillions, is that it drives crime, it drives corruption, it drives economic inequality, and therefore undermines democracy. Let me go back to where I started when I talked about trying to ask the right questions and get the right answers. The point for you, particularly you, the younger, going out into your careers, a key takeaway that I want you to grasp is that capitalism operating in secrecy and democracy trying to operate openly cannot coexist. They cannot continue to coexist. The reality is that these two basic tenets of our society, capitalism and democracy, are splitting apart, are becoming decoupled, with capitalism determined to operate outside the purview of democracy, and democracy, to some extent, allowing capitalism to do so. These two basic tenets of our society are drawing apart. This presents an existential threat to the 21st century, to the democratic capitalist system, an existential threat paralleling the threat of global warming. The bigger point is, again, going back to the beginning, for you, through your lives, I hope you will ask the tough questions and answer them to the best of your ability. Ask yourself the difficult questions and strive to answer them as you can. That's been what has driven me over these many years of my career. It's a lesson that I took out of Harvard Business School. As I said to you, I've applied it to many other aspects of my own pursuits. If you want to bring about structural change, resolve. You're going to continue to ask the right questions and strive to get the right answers. Thank you all. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Raymond. This is very illuminating, and I'm very glad you shared these stories. I have a personal story to tell regarding this, but before that, let me open it up if there are any group questions for Raymond in the context of his presentation. Okay, so if I can take the liberty of elaborating on what Raymond has just said, when he concluded his remarks by saying, ask the right questions in your professional careers, to the young people in our audience. I tried in my professional career, whenever these issues of transfer pricing came up in international tax planning, I would ask a lot of questions as to why are we doing this? Why is it necessary? There were times when I was able to prevail on the decisions and the final structuring of these transactions. And there were times when I failed because other people more senior than me asserted a certain point of view, and there's only so much one can do within the partnership framework of a large accounting firm. But one very interesting responsibility that the senior partner in the firm gave me in the year I retired from the firm was to get a group of accounting firms together in New York and ask them if they could agree on the transfer pricing practices that were legal, above board, and were not outside of the purview of the law, and egregious transfer pricing practices that were not ethical, not right, but which were still being pursued by accounting firms and law firms. And he asked if we could get agreement among the accounting firms to say that we would only stay on this side of the red line in terms of transfer pricing practices, because some practices are legal and ethical, and this is something that we can get into later, but there are others that are more egregious and which cause tremendous tax evasion and tax avoidance and puts both the companies and the accounting firms at risk. I worked on that project for about 9 months under the purview of the Aspen Institute Business and Society program, and Raymond was involved briefly with that in certain meetings that Raymond and I had with Judy Samuelson at the time at the Aspen Institute. And I was able to persuade PwC to come up with that list of practices that were acceptable and those that were not acceptable. And during that 9-month period, even though PwC has signed off on that list with great reluctance, I would add, we were not able to get agreement among the other 4 large accounting firms and the major New York law firms who participated in those meetings on that right-hand side of the ledger, the practices that were egregious, that should not be condoned. To my dismay, in spite of the fact that it was very evident that these practices were not right, were not ethical, were putting our clients at risk, we continued to get resistance from other firms, accounting firms and law firms, on whether they should be discontinued or not, whether all firms would take like a pledge of honor, agreement that if collectively we will not pursue those policies, then we are not competing with each other in trying to win clients by offering these egregious practices. So I give this as an example of how difficult it is to be in this domain of transfer pricing where there are clearly practices that are egregious. But firms will often use, law firms and accounting firms, and I think both are guilty in this regard, including my own firm, will often use this gray area to try to be more loyal to their clients, to try to win over clients, and to try to do things that they feel is more proactive for clients in order to retain them. And this is a real risk that we in the practice are dealing with, both accounting firms and law firms. And this is something that the public is not sufficiently aware of how the professional industry is really being compromised by the pursuit of clients and the mechanisms that enable them to take tax positions that are intended to help the client save taxes. The firms get a big revenue as a result of it, but the public interest is not served. So I share this as a personal experience that, to my dismay, we were not able to successfully overcome, but it's a reality that the profession still faces in the absence of any regulation on these kinds of practices that both accounting firms and law firms, unfortunately, continue to engage in. So I share that personal story because one of the reasons I've stayed in this area of tax justice and worked closely with Raymond and Thomas and others is because this is a constant challenge that we face in terms of where there's global trade, there are taxes that are resulting from it, but social injustice is also coming about because these incorrect practices continue to be followed by very large professional firms, accounting firms and law firms. So I mentioned that, but there's a question here from Michal. Please go ahead.
Yes, Raymond, thank you so much for the presentation. And by the way, I mean, happy birthday for the 30th. So the first question is, how did you celebrate your birthday?
Thank you for the question. I went to a play with my wife about Martin Luther King and what he did. Are you going to tell everybody how old I am, or does everybody know that already?
No, I'll keep a secret. It's between you and me.
Thank you.
Happy birthday. I want to ask you a question, but first, just a bit of context. A few years ago, I've been to this event where Bucharest University, one of the programs was reassessing whatever they were trying to continue their license, etc., and they were inviting partners. At that moment, I was working in a private company doing human resources, and they invited us because we had a common project together. And it was there one director of a high school, and then he was so funny because he said, you know what? Now these new teachers that are coming on board, they are in their 20s, early 20s, right? And they are already bored. And my question is, how did you keep staying so positive and optimistic about the present and the future? How do you do that?
I don't know that I can answer that. Perhaps what you're observing is I've always tried to maintain a sense of humor. And, you got to laugh at some of this stuff you see because it's so ridiculous. And maybe that's my explanation is to try to see the world not as a dead loss, but in many ways as a place you got to be able to laugh at it occasionally. What you see going on. That doesn't reduce the seriousness with which you approach the issues, but hopefully it keeps you a little bit balanced and upbeat occasionally, and happy to see some progress being made. Thomas, you told me once several years ago that I had lived a very interesting life. And you're correct. I have lived a very interesting life. It's been a life filled with interesting occurrences and a lot of risks. I've taken a lot of risks. My wife has taken a lot of risk. We've had serious things that we've had to deal with. For example, I was arrested following one coup d'etat in Nigeria as the government tried to blame me for being a long-term expatriate, tried to suggest that I had ties to the CIA, hauled me in, and after looking at my passport, they said to me, "Mr. Baker, you have arrived in Nigeria 3 days prior to each of the last 3 coups that we've had in Nigeria. How do you explain that?" I said, "It's very simple. I travel a lot and you have a lot of coups." So, you know, you got my wife. I'm in Saudi Arabia in sometime late 80s or so. And my wife calls me on the phone and says she's about to go to South Africa. And she has been informed by the U.S. State Department that her name has been put on a hit list to be assassinated. So she says, "I'm going anyway." I said, "Well, I'm not there to stop you." So she went and took the precaution of changing hotels every night, and finally recognized the guy that was following her around after she'd been there 3 or 4 days in the country. So she went to him and said, "Why don't you just ride in my car? We'll go to all of these places we're going to together." But, you know, that's the tip of the iceberg of some of the things that have happened to me and to us in our careers. And it has been an interesting life. I'm glad that I came out of my graduate school education with that interest in asking the right questions and in continuing to ask the right questions and try to get the right answers.
I think Raymond is being very modest in terms of what could put a smile on his face in terms of giving him hope, because these 2 books, you know, Capitalism's Achilles Heel and The Invisible Trillions, is perhaps the best contribution in the literature in this space, and it'll probably guide generations of scholars in understanding these issues and thinking of creative ways to deal with them. So I think Raymond's legacy is a very significant one. And I think you should always have a smile on your face, Raymond, for what you have contributed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. I think we are at the close of the hour. Thomas, if there's nothing else, shall we bring the meeting to a close?
Well, if I may, I wanted to ask one question of Raymond, and I agree completely with Krishen about the books. I think the books will certainly be landmarks and will live on and will be a very important legacy. And I wanted to ask you about the changes that you achieved in the real world of politics, and whether you can assess, you know, I mean, you talked about the concept of illicit financial flows, and they are now in the Sustainable Development Goals and so on. But that's, in a sense, you could say a paper victory. You know, they called it what you called it, and you found a very good name, and they copied it. Do you think that that you have made a difference to the way regulations are written, to the way government agencies work, be it in the United States or be it anywhere else in the world? And to the extent that you have, are there any lessons that you can give us about how one goes about something like that? How can one actually change the structures, the legal and institutional structures that play such a big role in enabling or otherwise the kinds of financial misdeeds that we are talking about?
I think we've made progress, not nearly as much as needs to be made, but we have at least gotten governments to pay greater attention. I say we and others have at least gotten governments to pay attention to shell companies. We've at least gotten governments to pay attention to the activities of enablers. We've at least gotten governments to do a much better job of addressing tax evasion around the world, but not as much progress as we need to make. I've said to you, Thomas, that the reason I decided to write my second book is because I don't think we're making progress at the pace that it needs to be made. There are many of our organizations that are dealing with particular aspects of this problem. That is to say, dealing with tax evasion or aspects of money laundering or human trafficking or drug trafficking or animal poaching or what have you. And I realized that approaching all of these areas, these particular problems, without an overarching framework in which to think about it is hurting us. And I decided to seek to, in my second book, to elevate these issues to a higher level. In some part, I was influenced by the climate change issue. In the 80s and 90s and the early part of this century, and even going back to the 70s, scientists and experts knew about global warming, but they were not getting anywhere getting this into the public consciousness. I realize that that's where we are in this issue. A lot of us that are involved in this stuff, and a handful of legislators, know that we have a lot of individual problems, but we haven't quite gotten this issue into what we call the Overton window, into understanding that it is a broad issue. In the case of climate change, it was Al Gore that put that issue into the global consciousness. In the case of dirty money, illicit financial flows, I'm trying to make some contribution to that with about 1/100th the statue of Al Gore, but I'm trying to make some contribution to that issue. We are making progress. I'm not sure that we're making progress fast enough to save the democratic capitalist system. If we had more time, I could talk about January 6th for a while, and how so many of those people were not the poor and the homeless. They were the middle class who were in many ways convinced that they will never be able to live at the same standard as their own parents. That's an economic disincentive to support democracy. We could talk about this a whole lot more, but basically, I'm trying to get this issue into a higher level so that when we address the particular issues, we have a context in which to think about this. We are dealing with an existential threat. I will look at you young people and say, the chance that you're living in a democratic capitalist system throughout your lives in this 21st century is not a given, not at all a given. I hope that it is so, but if it is so, it will have to come about as a result of capitalism taking on a different focus, much more than democracy taking on a different focus. Hope I'm making a little bit of sense when I talk about this.
Can I follow up with one more thought? One thing that you left out in your remarks to some extent is the political resistance, right? So Al Gore was the person who raised consciousness about climate change, but there were people owning fossil fuel reserves who were doing everything they could to stop and block and reverse any positive changes. And similarly, I would imagine that in the area of illicit financial flows, you will also have resistance, people saying, no, we don't want these kinds of laws. We don't want to have closer supervision. We don't want to have to break through transparency and reveal who we are and so on and so forth. In the US, famously, money talks in politics. There's a huge influence of money. And so my question is, did you feel that resistance, and do you think that that resistance can be overcome?
I feel the resistance. There's enormous resistance. The wealthy don't want to give up the amount of money that they're able to accumulate through use of the financial secrecy system. Don't want to give that up. So they buy the laws that facilitate its continuation. They buy from Congress the laws that are necessary to do that through lobbying contributions and through campaign contributions and so forth. So the wealthy will be drug kicking and screaming into a more transparent and accountable era. It is transparency and accountability that I ultimately believe are necessary to solve this problem. But it is, you're right. Krishen's clients, big corporations, corporate executives, they don't want to hear about this phenomenon. They want it to continue so that they can accumulate wealth. To me, more than any other feature in the United States, the growing disparity of income, let me put it slightly differently. The very exaggerated disparity of income is in very significant part, not wholly, but very significant part, a result of the way we're practicing the capitalist system, the way that we're conducting capitalism. That's going to be very hard to change. I can count the senators on one hand in Washington who are sympathetic to such steps. None of them happen to be members of the Republican Party. No, it's an uphill fight. But I'm hoping that we can make progress.
Raymond, thank you. We have one more question from Matteo. And Thomas, if you'll excuse, I have to leave for another meeting. If you can excuse me now. Thank you.
Run off. We'll wind up.
Yes, sorry. I just was maybe it's like even like a closing question to a certain extent. You made the remark that you think that a secretive capitalist system cannot exist next to a democratic system, right? Would you, I think one of the main ideas of democratization in the last turn of the century was basically to bring political decisions to the public. Do you think that we could even talk from that we should democratize the capitalist system, or that we should, I don't know, because I can't see parallels there. Would you say that's a way to put it, or?
I think that the democratic capitalist system has to re-energize its control of the capitalist system. It has lost its control of the capitalist system. And the consequence of that is, as I've said, these two things are not working in sync with each other. They're working out of sync with each other. It's going to be very hard to get legislatures to approve the measures that are necessary to accomplish this. One of the points that I make in Invisible Trillions is that the challenge, if the democratic capitalist system continues to separate, if these two basic tenets continue to draw apart from each other, the likely outcome is authoritarianism. Authoritarianism unites control of democratic and capitalist functions under the authoritarian or the family or the leader or what have you. For example, in Russia, if you're in business at the pleasure of Putin. And when you displeasure him, you get thrown out of the window. So, both the economic system and the political system are under the control of the authoritarian. A lot of people think the alternative to democratic capitalism is democratic socialism. I like democratic socialism. I like what goes on in Norway and Finland and Sweden and Denmark. I've been to all of those countries many, many times. Norway is one of our big funders. The difference between democratic socialism and democratic capitalism, as practiced in the United States, democratic socialism as practiced in the Scandinavian countries, is about 15% of GDP. That is to say, in the United States, GDP, government functions account for about 35% of GDP. In the Scandinavian countries, 50% or a little bit more of GDP. My point is, both democratic capitalism and democratic socialism work in the free market system. Both follow the free market system. So I don't think that there's an enormous amount of difference between democratic capitalism and democratic socialism. There is an enormous amount of difference between democratic capitalism and authoritarianism, and it is authoritarianism that beckons on the horizon, in my opinion, unless we do a better job of integrating the way that democracy and capitalism work together. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Okay.
Good. It falls to me to wind it up. I think we had a great day and fantastic content throughout. I'm probably one of the few who has seen it all. And a wonderful conclusion with Raymond Baker. And so thank you for that. And we will hopefully all reconvene tomorrow for the second day of the conference. Thank you, Raymond, very much for the wonderful remarks and for stimulating such a good discussion.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you all. Always my pleasure. You've got, you who are you've got what, 2 or 3 students in the group. You've got a rare opportunity with Thomas Pogge. Take advantage of everything that he can teach you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.